What Colombia is missing. William Ospina. Colombian writer, novelist, and critic born in the Hervio municipality of the Tolima department. What Colombia is missing. One of the most indisputable truths of our tradition is that Colombian society is founded on the example of the French Revolution and on the Declaration of the Rights of Man, as well as on its ideals of freedom, equality, and fraternity. When the second centenary of that revolution was recently celebrated, many reminded us how intensely we come from it and are children of its example. However, I believe that if Colombian society and the apparatus of its institutions demonstrate something, it is that no one comes from a distant revolution and no one can simply be the child of its example. A revolution is lived or not lived, and the pretense of inheriting its emblems without having participated in the mental and social dynamics that gave it life, without having conquered its victories or suffered its sufferings, is nothing more than a resounding imposture. Our history is usually characterized by that tendency to think that it is enough to repeat with rapture the words that expressed a time to already participate in it. It is enough that we shout liberté, égalité, and fraternité, so that luminous freedom, generous equality, noble brotherhood reign among us, so that we have already made our revolution. But in reality we are rushing to utter those cries to prevent that revolution from coming and to pretend that we already made it. 180 years after its independence from the Spanish Empire, the Colombian is a society prior to the French Revolution, prior to the Enlightenment and prior to the Protestant Reformation. Under the guise of a liberal republic, it is a colonized stately society, ashamed of itself and hesitant to take on the challenge of knowing itself, recognizing itself, and attempting institutions that are born from its own social composition. Since the discovery of America, Colombia has been a society incapable of charting its own destiny. It has officiated at the altars of various planetary powers, it has tried to imitate their cultures, and the only culture in which it has radically refused to recognize itself is its own. In that of its natives, its Creoles, its blacks, its mulatages, and its growing mestizages. It has also refused, after the magnificent experience of the botanical expedition was drowned in blood, to recognize itself in its nature. For this reason, he now pays the consequences of his unprecedented lack of character. It has allowed other peoples to impose on it a social and ethical interpretation of some of its natural resources. He has assumed the passive and miserable role of witness of how the logic of industrial society transforms, for example, the coca leaf into cocaine, frenziedly consumes it, irrigates the veins of its economy with its trade, and finally declares to the countries that cultivate it, they process and sell it as those who are truly responsible for the fact and the only ones who must correct it. Thus, a problem that compromises the crisis of civilization, the inability of modern societies to bring serenity and happiness to their crowds, the ethical emptiness of a declining age, and the growing need of this age to be confused with spectacles and substances increasingly exciting, it is turned by irresponsible governments and unscrupulous empires into a police problem, and it is always the servile peripheral countries that get involved that end up being demonized by the imperial finger. This is because it is a fundamental law of all power that the blame is always on others, and especially on the weak. The reason why human beings have so much trouble finding the causes of evil is because the last thing we do is look at our heart. We always look to the heart of the neighbor to find the culprit, and we are stunned with the infinite presumption of our own innocence. This is how the empire works. It incites, pays for, consumes, produces processing substances, polishes procedures, develops marketing methods, supports immense state apparatuses dedicated to instigating traffic in order to know it and be able to repress it, allows legions of officials to debase themselves and betray in the name of the country and the nation. Community, sanctifies degrading and disgusting practices under the old banner that the end justifies the means, and finally declares himself innocent victim of a conspiracy and calls for the crusade of the pure against the demons. But what happens in the field of international relations, and which repeats what always happened in the unequal relations between the country and the others, is just one of the frameworks in which the incredible reality of our country moves. How do you sustain a society in which everyone knows that practically nothing works? From public telephones that do not serve to make calls to bridges that do not serve to be used and public officials that do not serve to serve people and the armed forces that do not serve to defend the lives of citizens and judges who do not they serve to judge and the governments that do not serve to govern and the laws that do not serve to be obeyed, the spectacle that Colombia would offer to a hypothetical well-intentioned and sensible observer would be amusing if it were not for the pool of blood in which it rests. Any Colombian knows, nothing here serves a public purpose. Here there are only private interests. The Colombian only conceives of personal relationships, he only conceives his reduced personal or family interest, and to that sole purpose he subordinates all his public and private activity. Words like homeland cause laughter in Colombia, and the only beings who believe in them, the soldiers who march singing towards the war fields, are innocent victims who the only thing they can do for the homeland is die for it. Everyone else has a private business set up. And the most amazing thing is that the state itself is the private business of those who manage it at almost all levels. Woe to anyone who tries to moralize or set an example in such a bilge of appetites. Woe to the official who tries to work efficiently, when all the others derive their security from a kind of tacit agreement to hinder everything and to allow the state to be nothing more than an organism that perpetuates disorder and social inefficiency. Of the Colombian state it can be said that it presents two absolutely contradictory characteristics. That is, it is a state that does not exist at all, and it is a state that exists infinitely. If it is about fulfilling the functions that universally correspond to the states, providing social security, providing protection to the citizen, guaranteeing health, education, public cleanliness, equality before the law, work, the dignity of individuals, recognize the merits and punish the blame, the state does not exist at all. But if it is about base things, looting the public treasury, running over the citizens, chasing street vendors, evicting the homeless, profiting from community assets and above all guaranteeing privileges, the state exists infinitely. Nothing has ever been seen more helpful to the powerful and more grown up to the humble than the Colombian state. And why is that? Because for a long time the state in Colombia has been simply an instrument to allow a narrow band of powerful people to own the country, to open all opportunities to them and pave all roads, and at the same time to be the wall that prevents all social promotion, all transformation, all really generous sensitivity. The Colombian state is an absolutely anti-popular, stately, oppressive, and mean state, made to keep the great majority of the population in prostration and indignity. There is neither greatness nor true national spirit in him. Before, to verify this, one had to go and see how the towns on the Pacific coast, the towns in the interior of Bolívar, the agricultural regions, the lost villages remain in neglect. Now it is enough to walk the central streets of the capital. Now there is not a single field of reality in which we can say that the state is helping the nation, it is formulating a purpose, it is building a country. But where are the motorways, where are the bridges, where are the railways, where are the shipyards, where are the ports, where is justice, where is social security, where is agriculture, where is employment, where is the security of the fields, where is the work of the state? Is this robbery, this pettiness, this irresponsibility in all fields of life, is it the state to which we must bow, and which we cannot criticize because we would be accused of attacking institutions? I was taught since I was a child that all tyranny disguises itself with the mask of respectability, but that it is easy to know when a nation is in the hands of a tyrant. If no one can expect solutions from him, if the entire country loses hope, if the people are afraid to demand, to criticize, to disapprove. If impunity and misery reign, if the fields are in the hands of the guerrillas, the cities in the hands of crime, the economy in the hands of traffickers and relations with the world in the hands of the empire's delegates, is that a national state? Is it not rather the shameful tyranny of a caste of irresponsible bureaucrats dedicated to flattering one another, the choreography of reciprocal favors from all the agents of corruption? Where is the immense national wealth that the specialized economic newspapers proclaim? Why does it benefit the community as a whole so little? What masquerade is this to which we give the name of institutions? But the most serious thing about all this, or perhaps the only serious thing, is not that we do not know where the great works or the great purposes or the great examples are. The serious thing is that we do not know where the immense country that suffers these political miseries is. Nobody complains, nobody rebels. Nobody comes out in defense of the legitimate right to outrage. No one comes to repeat that Colombia was a great nation and that it was founded on great ideals. The town is mute. That he is poor, we know from the statistics. That he is out of work, we know from the statistics. That he has no protection, we know from the statistics. But where are those who claim, those who assert themselves, those who demand? Where are even those who ask? You can't hear anything. Silence and mist. Breaths of the arcane. The light lies, the song lies. Only the rumor of a vague vain wind flying in the canopies expires. This that the poet heard 50 years ago is what we continue to hear. But if nobody complains, is it not then that all this invective is an inordinate injustice? Could it be that there is an effort by the state to fulfill its duty and that for this reason the citizens are silent and wait? Are not the big newspapers right when they say that this is an exemplary and patient people who know how to understand the efforts of the ruling class to educate it, to cultivate it, to clean it up? The ignorant mob may not deserve much, but it seems they know how to be grateful. He does not rebel, he does not even ask, he simply waits with exemplary patience for the reward of such a long wait to fall into his hand one day. But the truth is that the people expect nothing. Or better said, don't even wait. Colombia, it must be said, has a sad characteristic. It is a country that has become accustomed to begging, and this means, it is a country that has renounced dignity. There are not only beggars on the streets, the state wants to accustom citizens to begging. The state, for example, does not fulfill its functions. He has no money, he says, since citizens do not pay taxes as they should. However, citizens do not pay taxes as they should because the state does not invest but misappropriates funds, wastes and steals. Thus the irremediable circle closes. But since the state does not comply, here are the individuals. Private companies, for example, are going to do us a favor by helping people. In the depressed communes, the abandoned coastlines, the lost towns, sometimes the charitable missions of the companies arrive to do what the state did not do. On the one hand, of course, all these philanthropic missions obtain exemptions and recognition from the state. But in addition, society owes gratitude to these generous apostles of the public interest. What's wrong with that? That we are accustomed to receiving and thanking as alms what is owed to us by right. Thus life becomes a miracle only possible through the philanthropy of a few, and society is never made up of free and haughty individuals, worthy and enterprising beings who feel they have the right to demand, who feel they are spokespersons of the national will, but for submissive and grateful beggars. But the state itself begs incessantly, and only in this area does it assume its role of setting an example. If there is a catastrophe, an earthquake, let's say, and in a medium-sized city 10 buildings fall, we can be sure that when the head of the disaster office is interviewed about what is being done to respond to the problem, the official will say, "We are already asking for help from international organizations." How? A country that is not capable of rebuilding 10 collapsed buildings? A country that first thinks about asking for alms from planetary organizations? That is the example of our state. While officials and contractors fly in here with taxpayers' money, may international organizations rebuild our buildings for us. And so spreads the most dangerous, the most discouraging, the most numbing of the nation's ills, the indignity, the lack of pride, the terrifying lack of character that eats away at the country and of which almost all of our rulers are notable exponents. Sometimes their memory may fail them, sometimes their responsibility may fail them, sometimes their ethics may fail them, always, at the moment when it is most necessary, their character fails. And in that they only show that they are as Colombian as the rest, because if our country lacks something, it is character. That's why we don't trust ourselves, that's why we don't feel in good hands when we're in the hands of our countrymen, that's why we don't buy what we produce and that's why we only value what others produce, That's why we hardly invent anything. Sometimes we never value what we invent. But are we guilty of having no character? And how is it revealed that we lack it? In the first place, when something has become so personal, it is already necessary to assume it as a destiny, and in the face of this it is only possible to face it or change it. We cannot take refuge in the pretext that we are not the cause of our ills, that we are children of history. If we are children of history, history has taught that it can take sudden turns moved by the collective will to change. But why change? This is where it is necessary to expose the danger of lack of character. For example, a nurse makes a mistake in the administration of a medicine. If he has character, he will be able to face the responsibility of his mistake, he will sound the alarm, he will say, "I have made a mistake, I assume my fault, but let's do something, let's not allow this person to die." If he has no character, he will try to prevent others from learning about the mistake, thereby producing a chain of horrible events. Later, the director of the clinic, with his corresponding lack of character, instead of assuming the fact, will hide the error for 3 days, will deny to the media that it has occurred, and we will all feel that this is a country in which we cannot trust anyone. This will present itself in all fields of life, and we will end up feeling that we are in the hands of irresponsible and foolish people who do not have the courage to face difficulties and to solve them with gallantry and with respect for others. That is why here, every time someone makes a mistake, they roar at their victim, so that they don't think they are going to show the weakness of assuming the mistake. And if the other claims, he will get aggressive. Much of our aggressiveness is weakness and stupidity. Just as our cruelty corresponds to a painful lack of imagination. Have we then no virtue? I think we have many. But the truth is that we will only notice them when we recognize our shortcomings. One of them is simulation. It is a defect that arises from the feeling of inferiority. The young lady who travels to Miami feels that because she is Colombian, she is naturally inferior to North Americans. So when she returns she will try to show that her trip has transformed her by shortcut into a foreigner, or has lightened her shameful Creole condition. He will then pretend to belong to that illustrious tradition. Thus, that simulation, that imposture, which seems arrogance, is an act of servility and ridiculous humility. This is what happens when Creole advertisers speak to each other in English to dazzle each other, when young people try to impress themselves with the brands of the garments they wear. All authenticity is considered a shortage, because you have a deep feeling of unworthiness and smallness, then you have to affirm yourself in the marks, in the poses, in the symbols. The young person who spends a few months in France will arrive visibly methodical, the one who spends a few months in Germany will arrive severely systematic, and this in principle does not show the capacity for learning or mental hospitality but the same old weakness of character. The one that makes television commercials full of people with fine features and clear eyes, because the mestizos who have always run the country are still ashamed of their faces, their language, their spirit, only their faces sanctified by a servile aesthetic, only the tastes inherited by our traditional lack of originality can be expressed. Thus we continue to play the game that we are exclusively a white, Catholic, and liberal nation, even though our cities are the most notable example of miscegenation and mulattage on the continent, although our religious life is the most amazing combination of spiritism, Santeria, witchcraft, animism, and hypocrisy that can be found, although our political life is characterized by the fact that the President of the Republic is elected by 10% of the population, exactly the same percentage who lives directly or indirectly from the state. From very early in our country there was this tendency to exclude and disqualify others, which has brought us to the heights of intolerance and social hostility that we suffer today. A Colombian hardly recognizes himself in another if they do not mediate a long series of ethnic, economic, political, social and family verifications, if you don't do a thorough exploration of where you work, the neighborhood you live in, the clothes you wear, and the people you know. And of course this hostility is not only from the rich towards the poor, they in turn feel the discomfort of relating to people who belong to another world, and they do not stop expressing their displeasure caused by the ritual of simulations that characterizes life. Social of the other classes. The stately contempt for the humble has one of its greatest strongholds in this country. Many would believe that this is a universal phenomenon, but it is enough to visit other countries to understand that in them certain principles of democracy are realities, not perfect of course, but much closer to the ideal that democracy suggests. Countries without extreme conditions of misery, countries that respect human work, value it and reward it, countries that do not allow themselves the indignity of having their streets infested with beggars, countries that do not allow themselves the degrading spectacle of having people on the streets who they feed on garbage. Because there are naked the absurdity and insignificance of our courtesan pretenses. While in North America it is said simply the White House, to refer to the most powerful center of government on the planet, in this country the seat of government is still called palace, as we learned to say it from the times when the shadow of the Escorial gave gloom to our souls. And the governments do not feel ashamed that El Palacio is a few meters from the last well of human misery, La Calle del Carducho, where numerous human beings of those that are insensitivity are confused with the garbage and with the crusts of the earth called disposables. But perhaps what governments want is for that symbol to be seen, power and scum coexisting in the same neighborhood, the caricatural plenitude of our institutions. Traditionally, countries achieve an identification with themselves from feeling that they are members of the same ethnic group, of the same tradition, from the evidence of affinities. But the main characteristic of the modernity inaugurated by the discovery of America is the convergence on each territory of the greatest ethnic, religious, and cultural diversity imaginable. Empires have always been victims of a deep contradiction. They seek to unify the world under a single power, but in this effort they uproot particular cultures from their isolated niches and bring them into contact with others. The result is not usually the dissolution of nations and tribes under the influence of official culture, but rather an exacerbation of nationalisms. The Roman Empire failed in its attempt to unite humanity, following Alexander's motto, "One empire under one God." Local cultures never ceased to exist, and today, 20 centuries later, Europe is a continent as divided into particular cultures, different traditions, and languages, as it was when the empire tried to prevail. Finally, the arrogant power of the emperors and patricians succumbed to the migrations that the same power of Rome aroused. The splendid and turbulent capital became a magnetic center that attracted men and women from all walks of life, and this siege of the shores against the center of the empire is what we call its decline and fall. Today something similar is happening. The great contemporary empire, by exalting its model of life as a universal law, fails to prevent the credulous crowds of the planet from rushing towards the center attracted by the irresistible magnet. But the hordes of immigrants do not come to submit to the paradigms of civilization, they are eager to take advantage of its advantages without giving up their national peculiarities. Sometimes immigrants to the North American territory, for example, sought to be Americans, to forget in the splendor of their new condition the hardships of their old homelands, persecution and poverty. America was the kingdom of hope. Today no one is unaware that the world's poor arrive there, not because they are disappointed in their homelands of origin, which they carry increasingly ardent in their hearts, but because they are driven by necessity. America is no longer a kingdom of hope but a kingdom of despair. It is not surprising that immigrants take advantage of the advantages of the New World but feel that they belong more and more to the small country from which they come, and this is even stronger because modern communications allow them an almost daily contact with their origins. Colombia was incorporated into modernity by the discovery, and it would be difficult to find a nation that brings together so many typical contradictions of our time. The conflict between the native peoples and the invading peoples has been in it from the beginning. As this conflict did not lead to an extermination of the native population in the manner of North America, a third element in conflict arose, miscegenation, which, being the son of races that repelled and disqualified each other, did not become a synthesis but a new contender, unable to identify with himself and who always sought his justification in language in the distant and illustrious. There are also the Afro-American peoples, whose parents came as foreigners and slaves. Their current children, theoretically freed from slavery, continue to be viewed as foreigners by the rest of society, and they have not yet undertaken a great takeover of the world to which they undeniably belong. But in addition to ethnic conflicts, emphatically denied by the establishment although they come to the fore in 1,000 different ways in daily life, a deeper conflict is that between the economic and political elites and the rest of society, discriminated against by their poverty and excluded from every opportunity. Added to this is the fact that from the 1940s onwards, a colossal process of exodus of peasants to the cities began, fleeing from ruthless rural violence, a process that in less than half a century reversed the proportions of urban population and population peasant. This would not be so serious if it were not for the fact that this small urban sector, led by the arrogant capital of the Republic, was deeply ashamed of the country to which it belonged, and received the peasants with a truly disgraceful incomprehension, hostility, and inhumanity. The peasants came from a long-established culture. They had a wisdom in their relationship with the land, a language full of grace, in which rudeness and tenderness found eloquent and lively expression. They were dignified and serene beings incorporated into a deep and profitable relationship with the world. Overnight, these beings were swept away by a raging wind that ripped them from the old firmness of their universe and threw them defenseless into an unforgiving world. His simplicity was received as ignorance, his nobility as stupidity, his elemental wisdom as clumsiness. It is impossible to describe in how many ways the immense masses of expelled peasants were suddenly turned into foreigners in their own homeland, and the term mountaineer became the stigma with which Colombia turned its back on its past and abandoned their children in the hands of the prejudices of modernity. Suddenly the country of simulation, unable to build something of its own in which to recognize itself, discovered the paradigms of progress only to use them against itself, and folded as always, without criteria, without character, without reflection and without memory, to the dictates of a hypothetical upper world. The main characteristic of the Colombian ruling classes has not been evil, cruelty or lack of nobility, but fundamentally stupidity. Or rather, it is from that stupidity that all other evils sprout like hydra heads. In all the countries of the world there are rich and poor, there are people favored by fortune and people abandoned by it. But the ruling classes of the great world not only assumed their patriotic duties early on, identified with the reality to which they belonged and admitted a principle of dignity in the multitudes of their nations, but also tried to be consistent. When they founded institutions based on elementary principles of equal opportunities and respect for human dignity, they at least tried to be faithful to those principles. Something taught them that one cannot with impunity allow misery and unworthiness to proliferate. The ethics of religions that felt responsible for their faithful, an ethic that compromised conduct, contributed to this in many places, while it is already known that the religious ethics of our nation is surprisingly based on the criterion that he who sins and prays empata, and suggests that religious life does not consist in doing well but in repenting in time. Here people feel that they are fulfilling their religious duties not if they are noble and generous to others, in accordance with the precept of Christ, but if they fulfill the liturgy. To be saved, it was not necessary to comply with humanity, it was enough to comply with the Church. From early on, poverty was allowed to proliferate here, because those beings of other races and other cultures did not deserve the respect and solicitude of good people, and they were hardly worthy of charity. For this reason, since colonial times there have been gamines in Bogotá, and it is still significant that even to name them they have resorted to the imposture of another language. Calling them that way, the French way, not only legitimized their existence, but also established a cultural distance with them. Even destitute children served these characterless Creoles to feel superior, to feel fine and illustrious. The idea that poverty is the problem of the poor made its way very easily in these lands of God. From then on the powerful felt that they were sufficiently fulfilling their duty if they allocated a fraction of their wealth to charity. But the state existed from the beginning to defend privileges, and despite trumpeting its republican and revolutionary roots, it was already that two-faced monstrosity that would continue to be for centuries. He had a face to attend to the powerful, made of deference and servility, and another, made of arrogance and ferocity, to dispatch the poor. The sensible castes of other nations understood that allowing misery to spread is fueling extreme danger. Poverty is not the problem of the poor, it is the problem of the whole society, and Bernard Shaw well said many decades ago that allowing misery to exist is allowing the entire society to be corrupted. That insensitivity, that selfishness, that lack of commitment to others will not charge us in hell, they are charging us here, on earth. By allowing there to be miserable, helpless beings that grow in hunger, in indignity, and in uncertainty, everything else is going to ruin. It's not that the poor can't live in this country, it's that the rich can't live anymore. To allow extreme poverty to exist is to make the gates around the residences grow, the locks multiply, an army of private security guards is necessary, it is to make sure that the children can no longer go to school in peace, that they cannot confidently go out to the parks. The clamorous stupidity of the owners of the country has finally meant that they too cannot be the owners of the country, that the streets are no man's land, that we all feel seated on a powder keg. Now, finally, those who always profited from national miseries, those who even from the poverty of others made their business, begin to feel that something stinks in Denmark and they rush to find, as always, the culprit. They will take time to understand, like Oedipus, who is responsible for the plagues of Thebes. An incredible stupidity made that finally nobody can enjoy what they have, and the country of selfishness, meanness, and exclusion devours itself while wondering why, if we all dream of happiness and prosperity, we see sunk in uncertainty and drowned by evil. Then we agitate pointing out the evil outside of us, in the lack of values of others, in the loss of republican virtues by the rest, in a satanic conspiracy of evildoers, because we are not able to look at our hearts. Chesterton said that good does not consist simply in refraining from doing evil, that good cannot be a merely negative and passive virtue, that good must be something that works, something perceptible by its fruits, just as white is a color and not a simple absence of color. That is why I said at the beginning that the worst of Colombia's ills is not what is seen but what is not seen. The immense excluded people who do not manifest themselves, or who have so completely lost their confidence that they preferred to retreat into personal life, live outside the corrupt and hostile state, trying to save themselves, as they can, and given themselves to the task at the same time precarious and heroic to search for subsistence in a struggle of all against all, because no collective purpose can be vindicated, because no one can feel worthy and proud part of a nation anymore. This is understandable to the extent that the national rhetoric debased the entire language of the great causes, wasted all those enormous words, those illustrious abstractions, until they became symbols of betrayal and imposture. I sincerely believe that after Jorge Elier Gayton no politician has ever uttered words that truly establish a community, ties of solidarity among Colombians. Since then, Colombia continues to dismiss its hopes in cemeteries and now, as a high symbol of the time, it does not believe in anything. The picture that the Colombia of today offers us, intimidated by itself, cornered by itself, sunk in a knot of cruel and sterile wars, where all those who obtain some benefit close their eyes and tell themselves again that it is only for now, that the storm will pass, that confusing picture could be described by these verses of W.B. Yeats: the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Yes, the evil of Colombia is the inability to react, the loss of confidence, the loss of hope, the overwhelming lack of character that makes us have made the mistake of reaching the society we have, and instead of acknowledging it, we close the eyes, denying us the difficult but promising transformation that history is demanding of us. Only when the great crowds of this country, including the leading sectors that are able to change their folly for something more intelligent and more practical, are filled with the conviction that the country would be better if we stopped impostures, simulations, and exclusions, only when the despondent and distrustful country is filled with the passionate intensity that today only those who live by war and chaos have, will we be worthy of a different destiny, and will we be able to change this chorus of useless complaints that is heard everywhere, for something happier and more fruitful. We would like the public telephones to be used to make calls, that the means of transport work, that the motorways serve to be traveled, that they be correctly signposted so that the most elementary trip does not cost us so much work, that the technology we use consult the country in which it is applied, and thus the roads do not sink because this or crack because that the products of our nature are known and used in a reasonable way, that we do not allow other peoples and other prejudices to dictate how to handle our wealth, that justice works. But for this it is necessary to know how we are and what we can commit ourselves to in a social contract. We have spent centuries disobeying perfect codes, transgressing admirable regulations and boasting of the perfection of institutions that no one respects. We would like the bridges not to fall. That the armed forces serve to defend the life, honor and property of citizens. That we really had the right to work. That work, as Jorge Eliar Gayton wanted, be as valued among us as in those towns that we admire so much and from whom we learn so little by giving ourselves only to vain simulation. We would like to live in a country of dignified people, where poverty does not mean social contempt or moral misery, where the state strives to dignify the population, where the police have something better for the poor than clubs and learn to be the servants of the community, instead of the arbitrary powers that they are now forced to be. We would like to find dignified and serene peoples throughout the incomparable national geography. May the best that we are come out on our faces, that nobility, that hospitality, that familiarity that always characterized our peasant peoples and that still encourages under the tensions and violence of modernity do not die. We would like to see the railways, the shipyards, the ports, see the coastlines favored by a truly national and truly respectful state. And we would like the Colombian state, which has already forced the nation not only to live without incentives and without protection, but to live despite its institutions, to become a minimally effective state in the basic issues of public interest that concerned, cease to be an instrument to defend privileges and guarantee inequalities, and give us, as Borges wanted from all states, a severe minimum of government. In Colombia today it is not about building an infinitely powerful, interventionist and annoying state, since society has fortunately learned to live without it, but about dismantling the iniquity of an anti-popular and abusive state, changing it for a simple but respectable administration and active, that it serves society to unfold its possibilities and to face the rich and unruly nature that has corresponded to us. A state that finally resembles the country, and that is directed by a national will. But for that to happen, the state of privileges, simulations, and impostures, the state of corruption and looting, insensitivity and disrespect for the citizen must disappear in an absolute way and does not deserve the slightest consideration. Its officials, its authorities, and its politicians are only the product of the bad habits of a long history, they are not the cause but the consequence of the state that exists, just as the state is the consequence of the society that we are and that must change if we want to survive. Thus, it is clear to me that it is not the state that can change society, but rather society that must change the state, not only its administration and its officials but its structure and logic. But for this, society itself must become another, and only from non-state social initiative can that new society emerge whose foundation is the moral seed that exists in everyone, and the dissatisfaction and boredom that the entire society already feels. Colombia is today a country where the poor cannot eat, the middle class cannot buy and the rich cannot sleep. Only by changing our way of being together, only by summoning the dignity of millions of beings and urging them to be the country, its face, its spokesman, and its purposes, only finally giving their place in history to the majority excluded and degraded by a amazing arrogance, we can hope for a country where once again it is a source of pride and greatness to live and die. What modern societies teach us is that we are all in everyone's hands. For how long will the privileged resign themselves to paying for their privileges with anxiety, advancing along the avenues amid clouds of bodyguards, just because the country in which they were born has ceased to be a homeland and has bristled with enemies? How long will it take to understand that something is wrong in the social order if the elderly cannot walk calmly through the parks, if the accidental disappearance of a child in a shopping center produces an indescribable horror? Our world has become rarefied, but how can we be surprised by that if its history has been a growing process of expropriation, not only of material assets but also of the dignity and the very human condition of legions and legions of beings? If the officials of the state commit crimes, if the depositaries of the public faith loot the treasure, if those in charge of defending the law and watching over His Majesty do not feel subject to it and violate it at will, how can we claim that it be those who grow up in abandonment, formed in bitterness and resentment, those who have nothing to thank society for, those who do not expect anything from it, behave as citizens? It is easy to download censures and reproaches, but a dignified country is no longer something that is owed to us by justice, but something that we have to deserve for our actions. As a friend told me recently, starting from scratch would be easier. If the task were to change the government, or change the officials, or change the state, everything would be relatively simple. It would be a problem of electoral campaigns, or of moralizing campaigns, or at most of great constitutional changes. But what is required is something vaster and at the same time more subtle. It is to change that mode of our being that is the substratum on which all the disorder of our nation rests. And the main legacy of our being Colombian has to do with what most clearly typifies us from the beginning. The most urgent task of humanity in general is the task of recognizing ourselves in the other, the task of assuming the difference as a wealth, the task of learning to relate to others without demanding that they bend to what we are or assume our own truth. Faced with the fascism that today reappear in so many places on the planet, there is this urgency to make the diversity on which life itself depends to persist in the world. The triumph of a single model, of a single path, of a single truth, of a single aesthetic, of a single language, is as great a threat as the triumph of a single species or in the plant kingdom would be in the animal kingdom. The triumph of a single tree or a single fern. In this defense of diversity, there is room for the struggle for the existence of many different nations, with their different languages, with their cultures, with their costumes, with their gods and, if you like, with their prejudices. And this is how the danger of hegemonies and imperialisms is better seen. In the Boer War in South Africa at the beginning of the century, Chesterton declared himself a supporter of South African nationalists in the name of English nationalism. Accused of treason, he replied, "I am a nationalist." To be a nationalist is not only to love one's own nation but to accept that others have theirs. Being an imperialist, on the other hand, is in the name of one's own nation to want to take their nation away from others. It is in this struggle for the recognition of the other and respect for him where the unique task of Colombians is inscribed in our time. Because like many modern countries and perhaps a little more, Colombia is par excellence the country of the other. And all his misery has consisted in the inability to recognize himself in the other because the other is always different. He is not the brother, nor the member of the ethnic group, nor the member of the tribe, nor the co-religionist, nor the member of the same social class, or from the same party. Each Colombian is the other, what is different, what is not confused with me. This extreme individuality is the fruit of all the tensions of the West condensed into a single territory. From the clash between Europe and America, from the clash between whites and Indians, from the clash between Catholics and pagans, from the clash between masters and slaves, from the clash between metropolises and colonies, from the clash between barbarism and civilization, and the impossibility of knowing which is which, the clash between the peninsular and the Creoles, the clash between the capital and the province, the clash between the city dwellers and the mountaineers, the clash between the rich and the poor, the clash between the educated and the ignorant, the clash between officials and individuals, the clash between the Caribbeans and the Andeans, the clash between those who are people and those who are not people, the clash between the Federalists and the Centralists, the clash between the Traditionalists and the Radicals, the clash between the Camanduleros and the Cumcuras, the clash between the Liberals and the Conservatives, the clash between the bandits and the good people, the clash between the armed forces and the subversives, of the long and reciprocal disqualifications between all these parties that hate and deny each other, without knowing that they are nothing more than the heirs and the perpetuators of an ancient curse, in the country of inherited hatreds and pedagogies of intolerance and resentment. Each Colombian is the other, and he will have to fight against his own heart to be a little more generous, a little more tolerant, a little more friendly, a little more hospitable. If we don't, we will continue to be the melancholic country where being intelligent consists in being clever, that is, capable of deceiving the other without scruples, where to be noble is to be an idiot, where to differ from others is to awaken the chorus of gossip, and where a kind of dark and crouched fascism continues to feed on hatred and exclusion. Borges speaks of the hydrographers who affirmed that a single ruby is enough to divert the course of a river. A single thing would be enough for Colombia to change to the unimaginable. It would be enough for each Colombian to become capable of accepting the other, of accepting the dignity of what is different, and feeling capable of respecting what does not resemble him. That is the change both vast and subtle of which he spoke. That is perhaps the only revolution that Colombia needs. And what Colombia is missing. William Ospina.